Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering the Splinter and Slide Whistle Stooges. Wonderful. Season 6 is really hitting me with all the infamous episodes, huh? And I'm talking about the Splinter here, though I know at least some people don't like Slide Whistle Stooges, but yeah, so it looks like I got an episode with visual repulsion and an episode with audio repulsion. Joy. Those aren't necessarily my opinions on these episodes, I'm just noting the commonalities in the complaints about these two. Alright, but let me just go ahead and move on now. As always, thank you to everyone watching today, everyone who likes and comments on my videos, and everyone who subscribes. And now, let's just get right into it. As I've already said, The Splinter is a notorious episode. On the forum, the episode discussion thread for this episode has 7 pages of comments compared to the average of like 2 for other average episodes of the season. Enough said. In my opinion, the infamy of this episode is a very large overreaction. Actually, now that I think about it, the way that I view the infamy of this episode has some considerable similarities to the way that I view the infamy of House Fancy. Well, I'll get to all that later, but let me just get into the episode first. I like the way that the Splinter begins. I love watching SpongeBob be so enthusiastic about his job because it's cute and makes me happy, and the scene is also boosted by including one of my favorite little OSTs, Tripping Upstairs. I don't know why I like that track so much since I usually prefer the tracks with the steel guitars and such, but I just do. This part of the episode also has some neat visual moments, like when SpongeBob takes out the ingredients, and once SpongeBob gets his spatula stuck in the ceiling, the bit where he takes it out just to say that it's stuck pretty good got a good chuckle out of me. I thought that was a clever bit of humor. Honestly, this first part of the episode is really good. Too bad it all goes downhill from here. Immediately upon SpongeBob getting the eponymous splinter lodged in his thumb, we're subjected to some rather uncomfortable images. And see, this is where the splinter differentiates itself from House Fancy and its infamous toenail scene for me. To me, as you might recall, that scene hardly looked graphic, but this episode features some pretty realistic, or at least detailed, paintings as well as SpongeBob's red thumb the entire episode, so you can feel the pain just by looking at it. And it just generates this uncomfortable feeling for me. I mean, on one hand, it's somewhat impressive that the artists and writers managed to do this with such perceived ease, but on the other, this still makes the episode a bit of a difficult watch. The other problem of this episode is the fact that it's honestly pretty boring after SpongeBob receives the splinter. SpongeBob's attempts to get the splinter out are just not that entertaining to me other than a neat visual gag here and there. The interaction between SpongeBob and Squidward is also disappointingly dull. Squidward's whole scheme to get SpongeBob sent home also isn't that entertaining at all. I feel like the episode would have been better if it was just consisting of SpongeBob struggling to do his job with the splinter and realizing he can't do it, so he then enlists Patrick to get it out. Just cut all of this Squidward stuff, it was unnecessary. I think the main issue is that there weren't really any attempts for humor for some, like, very large stretches of time in this episode. Not to mention that there's no way in hell Mr. Krabs would follow a workplace code like that. I'm not actually mad at that, I just thought it was funny. But back to being serious, this entire interaction is just dull, slow, and off. The phone call with Patrick is similarly boring. I did like that we got a callback to both Suction Cup Symphony and Suds with the playing doctor here, even if it was, yet again boring. Just so slow and quiet. I don't know what's going on here, but it isn't working. The med school joke was actually funny though, so there was that. Also, another thing about this section is that it's kind of nonsensical. Like, if Mr. Krabs is really that aware of things amiss at his restaurant and SpongeBob is this worried about being sent home early, then why the fuck is he not, actually working? SpongeBob spends so much time trying to get this splinter out, and so now I'm confused about him actually doing his job. It doesn't really matter, it's all to comedic, or at least attempted comedic effect. It's just something I couldn't help but notice since it's made such a big deal in the plot. Alright, now let me get back to the other big issue of the episode, the one that everyone knows about, and that is the gross out. And unlike House Fancy or Whatever Happened to SpongeBob or To Love a Patty, I gotta agree with the consensus just a bit. The last 2 minutes of this episode are freaking nasty. Thankfully, there are not too many shots of the infected Splinter, and thank God there isn't one of those close-up paintings of it, but there's enough shots for us to get the idea. Maybe it's because it's a hand injury, a common enough one at that causes me to have quite the visceral reaction when watching this part of the Splinter, like visceral to the point where it makes me want to turn off the whole episode. I'm just glad the situation is resolved quickly. As for the actual ending of this episode, it's attempted slapstick that doesn't really do anything for me, much like the other attempts at comedy in most of this episode. At least it's kind of satisfying seeing Squidward get hurt after all the emotional turmoil he put SpongeBob through, but it would have been better had the scene actually been funny. I can't tell which is the Splinter's bigger crime. Being gross or being boring? I find myself leaning more towards the latter because how could an episode so known for being disgusting be so freaking dull? This episode is a perfect representation of what belongs in the mediocre tier, which is where I'm placing it with a score of 5 out of 10. It completely fails at what it set out to do, but it also does not truly offend me other than some gross shots. The beginning of this episode also serves to prevent this episode from being considered barely tolerable, showing the reduced but still existent entertainment quality of episodes of this tier. A fun fact about Slide Whistle Stooges that I'd like to share is that this episode is the originator of two separate background tracks, Slide Whistle Stooges and Slide Whistle Stooges 2. Yes, I know, such creative naming. But anyway, I'm pointing this out because I like both of these tracks. The first one is great for chase scenes, and the second one is perfect for more chill scenes with less dialogue. And I just like sharing fun facts when I have them. Sharing knowledge and love makes me happy. But this is only tangentially related to the actual episode at hand, so let me get to talking about that now. So, I think I'm gonna get the big thing out of the way first, which is the slide whistle gag itself. It's the central element of the episode, and people have lots of opinions on it. And so y'all watching might be wondering, do I think this episode is annoying? Do I think the main gag is repetitive and or unfunny? To both questions, my answer is pretty simple. No. The slide whistle sound isn't annoying to me at all, and in this way I consider this specific part of the episode to be an answer to and improvement to Squeaky Boots, because it makes a sound that is annoying to the characters in-universe not be annoying to me. And the way the slide whistles are presented in this episode kind of reminds me of the notorious Johnny Test whip crack. It's kind of funny thinking of it that way. I also don't find the whistling to be repetitive or unfunny. Once I get into the more chronological rundown in a second, I'll expand more on this point, but in general I think the gag is varied enough to not feel repetitive or played out. Alright, so now that I can get into my chronological rundown, let me start with talking about the beginning scene. I mean, the episode is pretty entertaining from jump, and watching Squidward slowly catch on to whatever's going on is great. We're pulled right alongside him and trying to figure out where these noises are coming from. I also love how Squidward's like, it's too early for this, because that is a mood, and also one of my favorite phrases. But just like how SpongeBob says the slide whistling adds some zest to everyday life, it adds some zest to this episode. I love how SpongeBob and Patrick pull off all sorts of feats while slide whistling and messing with Squidward, and seeing Squidward slowly start losing his shit over the slide whistles was pretty entertaining, if not exactly funny. The ensuing chase scene is similarly amusing, especially with the new music in the background. From this point on, the episode shifts to another familiar kind of plot with Squidward lowering himself to SpongeBob and Patrick's level, as he'd probably put it, but then getting incredibly carried away. He gets in on the slide whistle action after a strategic stroking of his ego, which is usually how these plots get rolling. This was definitely a necessary change for the episode as well, because even though SpongeBob and Patrick chasing Squidward around all day with the slide whistles was fun, I'm not sure this would have been enough to sustain 11 minutes. And seeing Squidward get in on the fun is super enjoyable, both because it's wholesome to see him having some fun with SpongeBob and Patrick, and also because it's simply an entertaining sequence. The part at the bargain mart was great, and I love how Squidward was totally trolling that guy. Again, this is a pretty common plot in this show, having Squidward letting loose upon SpongeBob and Patrick's prodding, and so I'm reminded of episodes like Squidville and Skill Crane here. And I also love how Squidward gets increasingly out of pocket too, which was a good escalation of his behavior. Moving on, it should come as no surprise that I love the dramatics of the townspeople, pulling out the whole pitchforks and torches brigade to chase after Squidward for defiling the sanctity of Bikini Bottom. Man, this episode has a lot of chase scenes now that I'm thinking about it. But, I mean, the OST Slide Whistle Stooges is best used for chase scenes anyway, so I get it. They just wanted to strut their stuff. Anyway, I love the part with Squidward in the truck and how the driver just fully abandons the whole vehicle. This, of course, ends in some glorious universal justice for Squidward, and I love how he accents his fall with the slide whistle. It feels like the entire episode was made just for that one joke, and like all of the slide whistle buildup culminated in that, and it was just hilarious and perfect. And on top of that, the Band Geek-esque shot with SpongeBob and Patrick playing the sad music on their slide whistles only enhanced the scene further. And then the ending of this episode is great too, and a good continuation of the shenanigans that have been taking place throughout the entire runtime, with a good side of an everybody laughs ending. Slide Whistle Stooges was just a really fun and entertaining episode for me. I'd even call it delightful. It's just a very warm episode. I don't really have any real issues with it at all. I guess the only thing is that the episode wasn't super funny to me, but it wasn't particularly trying to throw jokes left and right since it was almost entirely focused on the one gag, so I'm fine with that. It's not a real knock on the episode. Frankly, I'm rather impressed that an episode about one general gag never got repetitive at any point, and stayed amusing all the way through. That's some shit that's worthy of amazing tier, which is where this episode shall be, coming in with a score of 9 out of 10. As always, I'll be ending this video with some closing thoughts of mine. One thing that I was thinking about when reviewing these episodes is that how both of them are very reliant on stimulating, for lack of a better term, one specific sense. For the Splinter, it is very heavily leaning on its visual elements, seemingly trying to gross the audience out, or at least that's all I can guess since the episode is boring otherwise. Slide Whistle Stooges, on the other hand, cares more about the viewer's sense of hearing. I just find that kind of interesting. It's also an interesting parallel because where the Splinter fails in its heavy use of one sense, Slide Whistle Stooges excels, at least to me. I think the difference comes down to variation and also not intentionally annoying the audience. If Slide Whistle Stooges did not vary things up, or more accurately, if it made the sounds of the slide whistles annoying, it could have easily ended up just like the Splinter. It's also especially interesting to think of it like this because an episode of the show that I know for a fact that I don't like has this exact problem of being extremely grating from an auditory standpoint. I'm not going to say the name of the episode just for, quote-unquote surprise purposes, but you can probably guess what it is from what I've just said. And that's just about the only closing thought I've got on these episodes, so I'm going to go ahead and close things out here, and I'll see y'all in the next review.